Millionaire Marries, his newly hired maid on a bet, but what he discovers on his wedding night leaves. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. That night, the sky over Los Angeles darkened like a warning. High on the hills, the Kingsley estate glowed like an ice palace. Breathtaking, but cold. Inside, the soft clink of crystal glasses echoed in a rhythm almost ceremonial. In the center of all that light and laughter stood a man who didn't need to smile to silence a room. Arthur Kingsley. Tall, composed, and razor-sharp, his gaze swept the crowd as if appraising every soul like inventory. And on that very night, somewhere between Pride and Pinot Noir, a cruel game was born. A woman with no idea what awaited her was about to become a pawn. The Kingsley Gala was more than an annual event. It was a summit of power. Here, wealth wasn't flaunted with words, but with posture, glances, and who was seen with whom. The women shimmered in custom gowns flown in from Paris. The men wore suits tailored to intimidate. Every hello was a calculated move, every toast a message. And yet Arthur needed none of that. He simply existed. And the room responded. He stood there, in a flawless black tux, one hand cradling a glass of scotch, his steel-gray eyes calm, unreadable. He had long stopped expecting warmth from others, and no longer offered it in return. Born into wealth, raised to conquer, taught early that emotion was a liability, logic was survival. Arthur didn't believe in love. He believed in results. And that's why he didn't have friends. He had allies, rivals, and tonight, one of each. Thomas Whitmore had arrived. A former classmate, now corporate competitor, Thomas walked into the party like someone carrying a loaded secret. Not as wealthy as Arthur, but just as ruthless, if not more. He approached with a smirk that seemed to stretch beyond his face, a glass of wine in one hand, a provocation in the other. Still believe money can buy everything, Arthur? Arthur turned slowly, as if he'd heard the question before. Money doesn't buy time, he replied dryly, so let's not waste any. Thomas chuckled, like a man who'd just baited a lion and lived to see the response. Then let's make this quick. I have a challenge for you, a little game. If I'm wrong, it'll be laughably easy for you. But if I'm right, well, maybe you're not the man the world thinks you are. Marry a woman with nothing, no beauty, no pedigree, no network, someone like a maid. And in 90 days, make us all believe she belongs by your side, as Mrs. Kingsley. Gasps were stifled. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Someone's glass nearly slipped. Bring her to every event, Thomas continued. Let the media see her. Let society talk. And if you fail, Rivera is mine. Your empire cracks. Arthur didn't flinch, but something behind his eyes shifted. And if I succeed, he asked, then I'll walk away from the Rivera deal. All yours. The room was quiet now, as if holding its breath. Arthur took a slow sip, set down his glass, and stepped in. 90 days? A stranger from the bottom rung? Fine, he said, cool as ever. But I won't just make her believable. I'll make you wonder if I ever loved anyone else. They shook hands. Cold, firm, final. And then, Arthur saw her. In a corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, was a maid. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, collecting empty flutes with the grace of someone used to being overlooked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun. Her uniform was spotless. Her presence, unremarkable, at least to everyone else. But not to Arthur, and certainly not to Thomas, who noticed his gaze. Perfect, Thomas whispered. She's the one. Plain, unnoticed, completely unfit. Let's see if your money can turn her into royalty. Arthur said nothing, but the decision had already been made. Her name was Maria, and from that moment on, without her knowledge, Her life had been thrown into the middle of a wager between two powerful men. A bet built on pride, a game played with power, and one woman, about to upend the rules entirely. Morning light crept slowly across the tall windows of the Kingsley estate's back kitchen. A soft mist still clung to the glass, and the first golden rays filtered through the heavy curtains like cautious whispers. The kitchen was quiet, save for the clink of dishes, the hum of running water, and the steady breathing of a woman who had started her day the same way she always did, silently and alone. Elena, slender, slightly stooped, her long fingers hidden behind faded rubber gloves, was a fixture in the house, but never a part of it. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She moved like a shadow. And most of all, she kept her head down. That morning, however, Arthur Kingsley broke that pattern. "Elena," he said from the doorway. His voice was low and smooth. Not exactly cold, but not kind either. She turned, visibly surprised. He rarely addressed the staff, never by name. Wiping her hands on her apron, she straightened. "Yes, sir." Arthur took a few steps forward, stopping just before the threshold of where flour dust met polished shoes. "I have a proposal," he said. "What kind of proposal?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. He didn't hesitate. "I want you to marry me for 3 months." The kitchen stilled. Even the faucet seemed to fall silent. Elena blinked once, as if unsure she'd heard him right. She'd once dreamed of marriage, but not like this. Not with a man she barely knew. Not with someone who saw her as part of a transaction. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, more confused than offended. Arthur calmly pulled a check from his jacket and placed it on the counter beside the sink. The number made her stomach twist. It was enough to erase the debts that haunted her, enough to hire a good attorney, enough to reclaim custody of her younger brothers, who were now at risk of being placed in temporary care. "I know you studied art," Arthur said, his voice even. "Dropped out when your parents died, took 2 jobs, raised your siblings alone." Elena stiffened. She had never told anyone in this house. "You had me investigated? I needed someone who fit the role. You, more than fit." She turned away, not in anger, but out of fear. Fear that she might say yes. She knew she shouldn't. But hours later, the phone rang, from child services. Her brothers would be placed in foster care within the week. She had no legal ground left to stand on. She had nothing left but herself. That night, she stood in the doorway of Arthur's study. No makeup, hair tied back, wearing a worn beige sweater and a face that had stopped hoping. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Arthur met her eyes, unsurprised. But she wasn't finished. "I have conditions," she added. He raised an eyebrow. "You may need a wife, and I need help. But I'm not a puppet. You don't own me. I won't change my name or erase my past. If I have to stand beside you, I'll do it as a person, not a prop." He held her gaze for a long beat. Then he nodded. "I can respect that." They signed the agreement. No flowers, no vows, no witnesses. The wedding took place at a downtown registrar's office, under dim lights and cold marble. She signed with a shaky hand. He kept his composure. But there was a moment. A flicker in his eyes. When she wasn't looking. The drive back was silent. Elena sat in the back of the limousine, clutching her worn canvas bag like it held the last piece of her real life. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't hopeful. She was simply somewhere in between. 3 months, a contract, and a woman whose heart had never truly been heard. But what Arthur didn't know was she might be the one to finally break through his silence. It began with a soft knock on the grand white door. Not urgent, not timid, but measured, like everything about the woman who stood behind it. "Good morning, Mrs. Kingsley. I'm Clara, your stylist." Clara Rousseau, elegant and poised, stepped in like a cool breeze, followed by 3 assistants, 2 rolling racks of evening gowns, and a suitcase full of high-end cosmetics. Elena stood motionless by the window, still wearing a simple cream nightgown. Her posture wary, her eyes unreadable. She had never seen so much silk and sparkle in one place, let alone have it pointed at her like a makeover project. "We have a charity gala this Saturday," Clara said, already draping gowns over chairs. "Mr. Kingsley wants you to make the right impression." Elena didn't ask why. She already knew, in Arthur's world, even appearances were strategy, and she had agreed to step into that strategy the moment she signed the contract. But that didn't mean she would surrender herself in the process. The fitting felt more like a test than a transformation. The heels were too high, the dresses too tight. The compliments were gentle but sharp-edged. "Posture, darling. Walk like you belong. Smile, but don't look needy." Elena listened. But she didn't bow. She wasn't used to being pampered, especially not while being silently judged. When Clara handed her a black velvet gown with a neckline meant to impress, Elena held it up, then looked Clara square in the eye. "If you're trying to turn me into a doll," she said coolly, "you've picked the wrong woman." Clara paused, then gave a knowing smile. "I don't want to change you. I just want them to see what Arthur sees, even if he hasn't yet." Saturday night, the Heritage Hotel. The gala shimmered like a film set. Crystal chandeliers, gold trim, soft violin music floating through the air. Every guest moved like a scene was being filmed. Every laugh was calculated, every glance loaded. Arthur entered first, tailored to perfection in a midnight blue tuxedo. Elena followed, her walk unsure, but her chin held high. Heads turned, whispers swirled. Some guests recognized her. Last year she was just a maid serving drinks. Now she was walking beside Arthur Kingsley. At the center table, Thomas waited, smiling like a man watching his trap spring shut. "Arthur?" he called, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Is this the mystery wife you've been hiding?" Elena caught his gaze, and she smiled, not sweetly, but like someone who had heard it all before and simply didn't care. "No mystery," she replied smoothly. "I just don't waste time with people who only talk to mirrors." The table fell into a hush. Arthur turned toward her, surprised and maybe a little proud. But the real moment hadn't come yet. When the MC called Arthur to the stage, he gave the kind of speech people expected, charming, eloquent, polished. But as he returned to his seat, something unexpected happened. Elena stood, uninvited, unscripted. She walked to the stage. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "I'm not from this world," she began. "I wasn't raised in wealth. Never wore shoes worth more than a month's rent." All eyes turned. The music faded beneath her words. "But I know something about dignity, about standing tall when people expect you to disappear. Elegance isn't found in the price of your dress. It's in how you treat people, especially when they have nothing left." Silence. The kind that says something has shifted, and no one knows quite how to respond. Arthur sat frozen. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the room. And for once, he didn't want to be. That night, back at the mansion, Elena stepped out of her heels and crossed the marble floor barefoot. Arthur stood near the window, untouched glass of wine in hand. "Why did you do that?" he asked, without turning around. She didn't look at him either, because someone had to. There was a beat of silence, then she turned, calm, clear-eyed. "If you thought I'd become your perfectly polished showpiece, you chose the wrong woman." The Kingsley mansion was unusually quiet that morning. There was no clicking of designer heels on the marble floor, No curt directives from Arthur echoing through the halls. The silence, once comforting in its luxury, now felt like something heavier, like the weight of unspoken things. In the study on the second floor, where the sunlight filtered through only half-drawn curtains, Arthur Kingsley sat alone, hunched slightly in a leather chair. In his hands, worn smooth from habit, was an old black and white photo. Himself, as a boy, standing stiffly between his parents. His father stood tall, stoic, unsmiling, a man who ruled his home the same way he ruled his boardroom, with expectation and fear. His mother, on the other hand, wore a soft smile, one Arthur remembered well. Not because it brought warmth, but because of how often it disappeared when his father entered the room. He remembered once, he must have been 12, he had asked her gently, "Do you believe in love, Mom?" She had paused, looked toward the hallway, as if checking to see if someone might overhear. Then, with a soft voice that broke something in him forever, she replied, "I believe in duty, sweetheart. Love is for people who can afford to be foolish." Arthur never forgot those words, and from that moment forward, he decided to never be foolish. But now, things were shifting. Since Elena entered his life, not just into his home, but truly into his world, Arthur had started to feel something he hadn't let himself feel in decades. Doubt. Not of her, but of himself. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when it happened. Arthur, returning from a meeting earlier than usual, walked past one of the unused guest rooms that Elena had slowly turned into her art space. The door was slightly ajar. The light inside was warm, casting a soft glow across the hardwood floor. And there she was, Elena, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a small desk. A worn sweater wrapped loosely around her frame. Her back was to the door. She was writing, carefully, slowly, into a little leather-bound notebook. He didn't enter. He just stood there, watching. Something about the scene stopped him. There was a stillness in her, and a sadness. She didn't notice him watching. Or maybe she did, but chose not to let on. He walked away quietly. But he couldn't stop thinking about that notebook. The next evening, curiosity got the better of him. Elena was downstairs helping the staff prepare dinner. Her room was quiet, and on the desk, right where he'd seen it, sat the little brown notebook. He hesitated. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. But he opened it anyway. Inside, he didn't find a diary, or secrets, or anger. What he found was love. Dozens of unsent letters, all addressed to Finn and Daisy, her younger siblings, her reason for everything. "Dear Finn and Daisy, I miss you both more than you know. Today I smiled at breakfast, and it hurt, because I wished I could share it with you, but I'm doing this for us. One day I'll bring us back together. Somewhere safe, somewhere ours." Arthur stared at the page, then another. None of the letters mentioned money, or resentment, or the deal. Just longing, determination, and love so quiet, it broke him open. That night, they sat together on the back patio. The evening was crisp. Elena wrapped herself in that same old sweater. Arthur poured tea for both of them, his movements careful, as if afraid to break the quiet between them. They sat in silence, overlooking the darkened garden, the hydrangeas swaying slightly in the breeze. "Do you write to them every night?" he asked, gently. Elena didn't answer right away. She sipped her tea, then stared out at the garden. "Not to send," she said finally. "Just so I remember what hope sounds like." Arthur looked down at his hands. These were hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, sealed mergers, and built empires. But tonight they trembled, because they didn't know how to offer comfort to a woman who had lost so much, and still carried herself with dignity. "I always thought," he began slowly, "that if I provided enough, money, safety, options, that it would be enough." Elena turned to him. Not angrily, not even sad, just tired. "Enough for who?" she asked. "Sometimes, Arthur, people don't need saving. They just need someone who sees them, who listens, without judgment." He didn't know what to say, and so he said nothing. But in that silence, something shifted. For once, Arthur wasn't trying to impress or manipulate or prove. He was just sitting beside someone who hurt and realizing that he had no idea how to mend her pain. And yet for the first time, he wanted to try. Not to win, but to understand. Elena stood to leave. But before she walked back inside, she turned, her voice low. "You think people like me want your world, Arthur. But I'd trade all of this." She gestured towards the mansion. "For one night of peace without fear." She didn't wait for a reply. Arthur remained seated in the cold. The tea in his cup had gone untouched. In his mind, the words of his father echoed once more. "Feelings make you weak." But tonight, Arthur understood something that frightened him even more. Not feeling is what made him empty, and Elena, quiet, guarded Elena, was the first person in years who made him want to feel again. The ballroom glittered with golden light, but Elena had never felt more exposed. She stood near the edge of the crowd, her champagne untouched, her back straight, but her heart pacing inside her chest. The final charity gala of the season, the last public event before the 90-day agreement would quietly end. And she was glowing. The gown Clara chose shimmered like the midnight sea. Her hair was swept up, her movements elegant, confident. The whispers had stopped weeks ago. Now people smiled at her, some with respect, some with curiosity, and a few with something darker behind their eyes. One of those eyes belonged to Thomas Lancaster. He approached like smoke, smooth, suffocating, inescapable. "Mrs. Kingsley," he said with a sharp grin, voice just loud enough for her to hear over the music. "Or should I say, Exhibit A?" Elena frowned, unsure whether it was a joke. "You've come a long way, haven't you? From polishing silverware to polishing public image. Arthur's quite the craftsman. Is there something you want, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked evenly. He took a sip from his glass, eyes narrowing. "Just to offer you something you clearly never got in this arrangement. That's truth." Elena's breath caught, but she held his gaze. "You think he picked you because he saw something special?" "No, darling. You were a challenge. A bet. A test to see if he could make someone like you pass for one of us." Her hand tightened around the flute of champagne, but she didn't speak. 3 months, transform you, parade you, convince the world, and himself, that he could mold anyone into a Kingsley. "That's not true," she said quietly, but her voice trembled. "Isn't it? Ask him. He won't deny it. Not anymore." Behind them, Arthur had just entered the ballroom. His eyes scanned the crowd, and then locked onto Elena. She was already walking away. He tried to move toward her, but Thomas stepped into his path. "Too late," Thomas whispered, smiling. Outside, in the cold evening air, Elena stood still. Arthur caught up with her, breathless. "Elena, please." She turned to face him, but there was no anger in her eyes, just silence, and something far worse, understanding. "How long were you going to wait?" she asked. "Until the clock ran out? Until you could say you won?" Arthur swallowed. His voice was barely there. It wasn't just a bet anymore. "I swear to you." She shook her head. "Slowly. Don't say that. Don't cheapen what I felt by pretending it meant something to you after the fact." He reached out. She stepped back. You didn't see me, Arthur. You saw a project? A mirror to admire your own power? And I was foolish enough to think you might actually care. He tried to explain. Words fumbled. Fell flat. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. She turned toward the waiting car. The wind caught the edge of her dress. She stopped once more, without turning back. I'm not crying because I was lied to, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. I'm crying because I believed you. Then, she opened the car door, and with one soft thud, she was gone. Arthur stood in the cold, alone, his hand still half raised. The ballroom music echoed faintly behind him, but in his chest, only silence. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. That winter came earlier than usual, not because of the cold winds brushing through Los Angeles, but because something quiet and hollow had settled between two people who passed through each other's lives. Too quickly, and far too deeply. On a quiet street near the old train station, nestled between two brick buildings, sat a small bookstore cafe. No flashy signs, no loud promotions. But every morning, a few regulars trickled in, picked up a worn paperback, ordered a cup of hot tea, and sat for hours by the window watching the leaves fall. Elena worked there. No one knew she had once walked through marble ballrooms or been chauffeured in limousines. To the world, she was simply a gentle woman, reserved, kind, with eyes that were calm. And sometimes, as if looking far beyond what anyone could reach. She wore no diamonds now, no velvet gowns, only a linen apron, a small notebook in her pocket, and a smile soft enough to warm strangers, but never long enough to reveal her own warmth fully. After that fateful night, Arthur Kingsley vanished. No media coverage, no appearances at high-profile summits. He declined invitations, canceled deals, including the billion-dollar merger Thomas had meticulously crafted to crown them both kings of the corporate world. No one understood why. Only Clara, the former stylist who had once dressed Elena, was the first to find him, at a school construction site in the outskirts of town. He wore a faded t-shirt, sleeves rolled up, sweat-drenched, carrying bricks with dust on his face. His once razor-sharp gaze had softened. Less a weapon now, more a man learning to see again. Arthur didn't walk into charity with money. He walked in with his bare hands. He helped rebuild a local school for underprivileged kids, the same school where Elena's late mother used to teach. He funded a program for orphans, kids Elena had quietly supported with holiday gifts. He donated every dollar he earned from the bet, anonymously, with no press. I'm not doing this for anyone, Arthur told Clara when she asked. I'm doing it because I don't know how to live, unless I start over. Arthur began to rediscover himself, not through headlines or applause, but in the laughter of children, the firm handshakes of laborers, and the quiet afternoons reading books to a class full of kids who never asked about his past. A boy once asked, "Mister, who are you?" Arthur replied, "Just someone who forgot that kindness doesn't need a reason." She never looked for Arthur, never wrote. But sometimes Clara would bring back a photo. Arthur playing guitar in the dirt with children, wearing an old cap, his shirt covered in paint. Elena would stare at the photo. Not crying, not smiling, just whispering, "He's really learning to be human." Arthur, though unaware of Elena's whereabouts, kept one quiet ritual. Each afternoon he would brew 2 cups of tea. One for himself, one for her, and place it on the seat across from him, and wait until it went cold. He didn't call it hope, just the shape of redemption, perhaps. In the attic above the cafe, Elena began painting again, the thing she had abandoned when her parents passed. Each canvas, whether of strangers, cities, or children, always held an empty space, like a memory that refused to close. In her notebook, a new line appeared, I've forgiven. Not to bring you back, but to walk forward without bitterness. No one knew if they would ever meet again. But one thing was certain. The man who once saw people as games now understood that the simplest things were never meant to be won, but cherished. And the woman who was once made a pawn now wrote her own rules with hands that had once broken and healed quietly from within. That morning the city woke slowly. A soft mist still clung to the glass storefronts, filtering sunlight like a veil reluctant to rise. The new school on the city's edge sat quiet, its walls freshly painted, windows reflecting a future not yet written. Clara stood under an old maple tree near the entrance, the crisp autumn wind stirring the hem of her coat. Beside her was Elena, her expression unreadable, her arms folded across her chest, as if bracing for something she wasn't sure she was ready to feel. They didn't speak right away. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was careful. Finally, Clara turned, voice low but steady. You don't have to forgive him, Elena. Forgiveness isn't a gift we're obligated to give. But if you want to know whether someone's really changed, look at how they treat people who have nothing to offer them. Elena said nothing, but her eyes drifted toward the schoolyard. Children were running freely, laughing, drawing on the concrete with bright chalk sticks, and in the shade of the far corner, half hidden behind a patch of flower beds, stood Arthur Kingsley. He didn't look like the man she once knew. No tailored suit, no polished shoes, just an old denim shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and dusty jeans with streaks of dried paint across the knees. He was sitting on the ground, helping a group of kids draw butterflies on oversized paper sheets. His hands were smudged with color. His smile was small, but real, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked present. Not superior, not guarded, just present. Arthur looked up and saw her. For a second, his breath caught, not from fear, not from guilt, but from the quiet shock of seeing the woman whose absence had reshaped his life. He rose slowly, not rushing, not desperate, just steady, as if he didn't want to startle the moment. Elena stepped forward. They stopped a few feet apart. No embrace, no grand gestures, just two people standing in the open, with nothing left to hide behind. I didn't think you'd still be here, Elena said first. Arthur nodded. I couldn't leave. She looked down at the dirt between them, then back up. I'm not here to forgive you. I know, he said gently. She crossed her arms but didn't step back. Her voice was firm but not cruel. I needed to see for myself, to know if you were really living differently, or just wearing another mask. Arthur took a quiet breath, then said, I'm not performing anymore, Elena. I'm not chasing a win. I'm here. Because for the first time, I know what it feels like to do something that matters. He glanced over his shoulder, toward the children still coloring. They don't care who I used to be. They just want someone who sees them. That's something I never learned how to do, until I lost you. Elena didn't flinch. She listened. Then, after a long pause, she said, I'm not here to forget, but I can see that something in you has shifted. And maybe that's enough for me not to walk away right now. Arthur didn't respond with words. He just nodded, a quiet gratitude settling in his chest. Just then, a little boy tugged on Arthur's sleeve and pointed to a drawing. A stick figure girl in a blue dress standing in a field of red tulips. The boy grinned. That's her, right? Arthur looked at Elena. Looks like they noticed, he said with a soft smile. Elena let out the faintest laugh. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't guarded. It was something in between. A laugh that remembered pain but didn't cling to it. They didn't make promises. They didn't talk about tomorrow. But they stood there, side by side, letting the silence stretch between them. Not as a wall, but as a space for something new to grow. Sometimes, the most honest reunion doesn't come with flowers or apologies. Just two people who meet again, open, uncertain, and willing to try differently. The late spring air carried a quiet kind of warmth, the kind that softened even the hardest corners of stone. As twilight settled over the hills above Los Angeles, the Kingsley estate glowed not with opulence, but with something far rarer: restraint. No guests arrived, no valets bustled in front of the marble stairs, no flash of cameras, no curated wine lists or orchestras in tune. For the first time, the mansion, long a stage for vanity, felt like a home preparing for something honest. Arthur had spent weeks restoring the garden himself. Not by command, but by hand. He'd pulled weeds, dug through soil, planted climbing roses in shades Elena once mentioned in passing. Deep blush, pale lavender, creamy white. He'd asked Clara for help stringing up lights. Nothing dramatic, just small golden bulbs draped from tree to tree, glowing like stardust caught in their branches. At the center of the garden stood a simple table. 2 wooden chairs, aged but sanded clean. Between them, a lantern flickered against the coming dark, casting a warm halo across the weathered wood. Arthur paced for a moment, then stopped. He adjusted the sleeves of his linen shirt, not ironed, not tucked, just comfortably worn. His heart was beating hard, but not from fear of rejection. This wasn't a moment he was trying to win. It was one he needed to get right. For her. For them. Elena arrived just before the sky turned navy. Clara had told her nothing, only that if she ever wanted to know what kind of man Arthur had truly become, this was the night to see. She walked through the back entrance of the estate and found herself staring into the garden she once swept leaves from in silence. But now, it was transformed. The roses, the lights, the stillness, and Arthur, waiting, alone. He didn't move toward her. He simply looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. A mutual recognition that time had reshaped them both. She stepped forward slowly, her hands relaxed at her sides. There was no tension in her walk, but no certainty either. As she reached the table, Arthur gestured to the chair. She sat. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and gently placed an envelope on the table. It was sealed with no wax, no emblem, just folded paper and handwriting she didn't recognize at first. His. "I wrote this," he said, "because I wanted you to have something that wasn't rehearsed. Just real." Elena's fingers lingered on the edges of the paper. She opened it carefully. Arthur watched in silence as her eyes scanned his words. "Elena, there's no speech that can undo what I did, no letter that can erase what you felt. But I needed you to know what's changed, not just outside me, but inside. I used to believe love was weakness, that control was everything, that people were either assets or threats. You didn't argue with me. You didn't try to fix me. You just lived, with dignity, with truth, with fire, and it undid me. I am not the man you met. I'm not yet the man you deserve. But I am trying. Not to win you back, not to clean the slate, but because, for the first time in my life, I know who I want to be. And it's someone who would earn your respect, whether or not he ever has your love again." Elena's fingers trembled slightly as she folded the letter back. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the lantern, at the roses, at the spot on the ground where she once spilled water from a flower vase, back when she was invisible. And then she looked up, Arthur now kneeling. No diamond ring, just open eyes, and hands that held no expectations, only hope. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said, voice steady, "and I'm not asking you to pretend. I just needed to say, I see you now, fully, no filters, no projections. He took a breath, then added, If you're willing, I want to build something with you. No more contracts, no more secrets, just life. As it is. Elena sat in silence. Not the heavy kind, the kind that lets emotion settle into its place. After what felt like a full breath of time, she finally replied, her voice quiet but clear. I'm not an angel, Arthur. I've made choices that cost me too, and I can't promise I'm ready to trust again. But if you're done hiding, if you're really done performing, then maybe we can figure this out. Together. Arthur didn't smile. He closed his eyes, let the moment wash over him, then opened them again with the softest gratitude. She stood. He rose too. There was no kiss, no dramatic music, just the sound of crickets beginning to hum in the tall grass, the wind gently shifting the rose petals along the stone path. And two people, who had once played a game with each other's hearts, now choosing, quietly, to start over. Not at the beginning, but from the truth. They never had the grand wedding people expected from a man like Arthur Kingsley. No cathedral, no white doves, no orchestra swelling at the kiss. Instead, one warm afternoon, they hosted a quiet gathering in the garden of a rebuilt community center. The very same one Arthur had once helped fund, and Elena had later volunteered at. There were folding tables covered with mismatched cloths, paper lanterns strung between trees, laughter in the background, kids weaving between chairs, and the scent of baked bread and fresh flowers mingling in the breeze. And there, near the edge of it all, sat Arthur and Elena, side by side. Not center stage, not performing, just present. He poured her a glass of lemonade. She passed him a slice of cake. They smiled. And for a moment, they didn't speak, because they didn't need to. So much had been said. So much had been lost, broken, rebuilt. But tonight was not about regrets or redemption. It wasn't even about vows. It was about choice. Two people who had once hurt and misunderstood each other, now choosing, of their own free will, to stay. Not because of any contract, not because of any bet, but because somehow they had grown toward each other and found something real in the ruins. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and candles flickered low, Clara passed by and nodded at them both. Her eyes said what words couldn't. And in the distance, one of the children Arthur had once taught waved, holding up a crayon drawing that read, "Thank you." Arthur looked at Elena. She met his gaze, calm, steady. There was no need to say, "I love you." They had already proven it in the hardest way. By surviving the truth, by changing, by showing up again when it would have been easier to disappear. And in that silence, something powerful took root between them. Deeper than romance, sturdier than passion. A quiet, resilient kind of love. They didn't promise forever. They promised today, and maybe tomorrow. One day at a time. And that, sometimes, is more than enough. True love isn't something you prove. It's something you learn to be worthy of. There are things money can buy, but forgiveness and trust, those must always be earned. And as the last candle burned low, the story didn't end with happily ever after. It ended with something better. Love doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs two people brave enough to begin again, with kindness. If you've made it this far, comment the word love below, so we know you're one of the true companions on this journey, a real fan at heart. What did you think of the ending? Would you choose to forgive? Or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy heartfelt, down-to-earth stories like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the next journey. Until next time. See you in the next story.